boat around. And
Were those 471, 671?
no, these were Caterpillar 1000s.
1000?
Later we got new engines and put 6V70, 12V71s, I think there was in that boat, but that was years and years later. And then they had another boat motors after that, but originally it was those Caterpillar 1000s, which were really good engines. Really.
So the Longhorn
really
was dual screw, double screw.
yes, yeah. And by that time, by the time we built that boat, got to that point, Dr. Parker was not director anymore, and Dr. Oppenheimer was the director. Well, Dr. Oppenheimer says to me, John, we want to have a contest to name the new research vessel. And I said, well, I think it may already have a name. He said, what do you mean? Well, we were thinking it could only be named the Longhorn. He said, no, it can't be named the Longhorn. And I said, well, now Jack had done this, actually Jack had done this on his own without me even. He said, it's too late. We've already welded it on. We had a steel plate that said Longhorn, and it was welded right on the ship. So Jack Shanklin named the Longhorn, and Dr. Oppenheimer didn't get to have his contest to name it.
Oh, we've got about 9 minutes, John, to close in on 1 hour. And you had a few more topics here: anecdotes, stories, maintenance, and office.
Okay, but first let me I forgot to mention on the Longhorn. I wanted to mention one thing.
Absolutely.
One of the things, the best thing about our supporting staff there at the lab was we really had some great people back there. 30 years that I was in there anyway, I thought we did. And one of the guys we had was a cook on the Longhorn named PAPHA. And this guy was just fabulous. And people would go out on that boat and come back after a cruise and weigh 6 or 8, 10 pounds more than they had weighed before. And PAPHA was kind of an old guy. And officials at the personnel office at the university called me up and said, you've got to retire Mr. DeMatch. His mandatory retirement at that time at age 65. Is you have just got to retire Mr. DeMatch. He's 65 years old. No matter how I pleaded, how healthy this guy was, how good that was a flat rule, so I had to let him go. But the funny thing was that when PAPHA went to work for the university, he just accidentally lied about his age by 10 years. And he was actually 75. And when they made me retire him, saying that no one 65 years old could do this work, he had already been working for 10 years past his mandatory retirement age, and I accidentally didn't know about it. and so that much for mandatory retirement at age 65. And we had another great cook on following PAPHA, which was Billy Slingerland, that's a teacher here in town now for several years. And I don't know that. I guess one big area of operations. One thing that the lab does, the Marine Science Institute does, other than basic science, is to have what they call now Marine Education Services. And Rick Tennant is...
Are you saying green?
Marine Education Services. And Rick Tennant worked his whole career, is now retired, but he was brought in by Dr. Parker. When Dr. Parker was the director, he brought Rick in to be Marine Education Services. And thousands and thousands of school kids go through the lab under that program. And when I first went to work there, of course there was no Rick Tennant, and it was called a visiting class program. And so, among all the other dirty jobs that were handed out, that was handed to me. And things were so tight financially that they only had one net to pull with the boat. And we were using that for visiting classes. But this net had been bought on a grant from the Texas Parks and Wildlife. And the fellow who had that grant came to Dr. Odom and says, well, you know, if you guys go out there with this visiting class and you lose that net, I'm not going to have a net for my research. I don't want you using that net. And there wasn't any money to buy one small little old, it's about the size of a tri-net for shrimping. There wasn't any money to buy one small little net, and we had a class coming in, and they were expecting a boat trip. And I said, well, Dr. Odom, what am I going to do? He says, oh, I don't know, you just do something. You just go pull a little drag or something. And all I could find was some little old thing that had bent iron around and had three prongs on it. And I went out there and pulled that thing out. And those people must have thought the University of Texas was just crazy. All I came up with was one beer can that thing had speared. But,
John, when you, at that point, let's say a few years before your separation from the institution, what was your job title?
My job title was Associate Director Administration. Associate Director Administration, and it got really, I essentially did the same dadgum thing my entire career, but I was administrative assistant, I was executive assistant, I was an administrative associate, I was marine laboratory manager, and then I was made associate director administration. At that time, I was kind of split up, and in a way, part of my salary was paid by the research budget, and part of my salary, major part of it was paid by the physical plant. And technically, I had two bosses, although I answered to the director of the physical plant at the University of Texas, as well as to the director of the Marine Science Institute, but never really created a problem except in the mind of the dean. But it really worked pretty good.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes. You have some wrap up for us? Mark, do you have a question?
Ladybird's visit. I have two things. One ladybird. The other one is was Rick involved in getting the Katie? That was part of his program, or is there anything you can remember about the Katie?
Oh, well, sure.
And marine education.
Yeah. Well, the Katie. See, the Katie was primarily for marine education services, primarily. And Rick was already on board at the lab by the time we got the Katie. So yeah, it was a boat that Marine Education Services used quite a bit. The Katie was a Thompson trawler, no relation to me, but there has a company down in Florida that I found that made trawlers. And the hull was originally designed by, if I can think about that name of that architect, but he was a student of John Gardner's, and he was a real fine architect that designed a seagoing yacht. And then after they built one yacht, they took the hull, the forms, and made trawlers out of them. And they sold several of them, and ours was the first one that took the standard power. Everybody, all the shrimpers always had their own ideas of the power, but it came standard with a 671 diesel, so I thought that was about the right motor, so we went with that, and it was pretty much of a standard Thompson trawler.
But that was new when it came to the university.
Yeah, it was built especially for the university, just like the Lorraine. Yeah, it was built for us, and but it wasn't highly modified, except we had, I guess, where the shrimp would have gone, we put some living accommodations was the main thing. A lot more electronics and stuff. That's been a really good boat too. Yeah.
Could we name-wise step through the different vessels the Institute's had, starting with the Ciencia, would that
Yeah, yeah. The Ciencia, and then there was the Lorene,
be? Okay,
and but then we had a boat that was called the Vagabond, and this was a 38-foot Fairform flyer that it belonged to Eddie Singer, who was the president of Pontiac Refinery, and he donated to the university.
okay.
We had some difficulties with that boat, starting with the first when we went to go get it down at the T-Heads in Corpus. We put high octane gasoline in the water tanks, which was the way to start out. And then there was the Marcia K, followed by the Longhorn, and the Longhorn served there for well over 30 years, 35 years or so. They got rid of her after I was gone.
And then the Katy was after the one?
No, the Katy was simultaneous with the Longhorn.
Same.
Katy came in the 80s. And Mark, you asked about
And
Ladybird.
the stretch on the Longhorn, was that because they had grants to be able to do science and they needed a bigger ship, or what was the reason for that?
It was to so she could stay at sea longer and do work deeper in the Gulf, carry heavier equipment, be more comfortable. Yeah, that was in 1985, and it was a midlife refit and a lot of new steel put in and replacements done at that time, and a total new deck house, and that was a real fun project we had down in Alabama.
What's the current vessel at the Institute?
They
They don't have
They don't
one.
have one.
They still have the Katy. They don't. They don't have a replacement.
The Katy is still afloat?
Oh, the
Yep.
Katy's still
Katy
doing
uses
fine.
it every day.
Yeah, that's been-
And Ladybird,
Ladybird, she was a real fine person. She was a member of the Marine Science Institute Advisory Council, and at the same time that she was a member of the Board of Regents, I believe. And anyway, she was associated with us through both of those ways, but I think primarily the Board of Regents. And yeah, she came down here and visited. I went down to the airport with the Secret Service to inspect and make sure there are no potholes in our Port Aransas airport that were going to upset Ladybird's airplane. And we had a lunch for Ladybird at the cafeteria, and I hired my aunt, Mrs. Fortson, to come out and help us decorate, and I wasn't too sure that the cook was competent the turmoil. It was just going to be too much stress on her, and I wanted somebody there to kind of hold her hand, and Mrs. Fortson did that, and they decorated that place like you wouldn't believe, with red, white, and blue, and all sorts of things. And Ladybird sat down, and the mayor was Dennis Dyer, and what was his name? Sonny Matthews was constable, I think. And Dennis Dyer sat on one side of Ladybird, and Matthews on the other side of Ladybird. And about every 5 or 10 minutes, Dennis would turn to her and say, "Well, Mrs. Johnson, we've got a real fine little town here in Port Aransas." And then things would settle down, and he'd turn to her again and say, "Well, Mrs." And the funny thing was, too, though, that we had a guy out there at the lab who had, trying to think of his name. I can't think of his name, but he asked if he could get permission to approach Mrs. Johnson and talk to her, because he had met her once before and he wanted to see if she remembered. And so we asked the Secret Service if it'd be all right, Wilbur and Rocket, if Wilbur and Rocket went and talked to Mrs. Johnson. And they said yes, and he went up and says, Mrs. Johnson, do you remember back when Lyndon was campaigning for Congress, and y'all had an old Ford car, and you were out there, it was out on some country road out there from Austin or someplace, and you gave me a ride. You talked about, he had several things that he remembered that he had talked to him about, you know, and boy, she either has a wonderful memory, or else she could just fake it great. She said, oh yes, how have you been doing? I can't wait to tell Lyndon that we saw you. And you know, she did an inspection of the whole place, and we had one area where we had all our grounds equipment. And I'd had the carpenter build a rack for all the shovels and the hoes and things like that. And of course, we had really got things spruced up for Mrs. Johnson. I mean, we had that place spick and span like you wouldn't believe. And so that place, we took her in there, and she looked at that, and she looked around, and she said, oh, this is so nice. If I could just get Lyndon to keep his stuff.
Well, I think Lyndon Johnson's a good note to end on. And thank you, Mr. Thompson.
You're welcome.
I look forward to talking to you next time about the Boy Scouts of Cub Scouts and Wibelows of Port Aransas, Texas.